Okay, so we're going to start off from the beginning. Hello, my name is Charles Lincoln, and I'm writing my thesis on comparing U.S. tax jurisprudence and OECD approaches to risk allocation in the post-BEPS era of transfer pricing. Um, First of all, I'm going to focus on a few basic concepts in my presentation to hone in on the problem between the U.S. tax jurisprudence and the new proposal for risk allocation. First, let's start off with a basic concept where you have an individual owning an asset. This could be any solo practitioner gaining some sort of benefit. The basic format of this involves it could be owning money, making investment decisions, even owning some sort of like making chairs, simple manufacturing business. The individual, in this case, the individual is taxed. But let's say we change the scenario and we create some sort of corporate entity, a limited liability company, even a partnership of sorts, and then we create that around the asset. The individual acts as an agent for the principal, which is the company. And we attribute human action to the company. And this is completely a legal fiction because you can have the same scenario occurring with the company and without the company. But in this case, since we've accepted the fiction of a legal form, the company is taxed. This is basic concepts of taxation that would apply even in a domestic sense. But let's say we change that and we create two companies. One is the manager of the asset, around the smiley face, and one is the asset itself. In this case, traditionally, in an international tax environment, the company of the asset will be taxed. And this is what the U.S. tax court does currently as well. So traditionally, in a transfer pricing analysis, we would allocate risk through to the asset. But what the OECD is proposing through its new risk allocation method is that we tax the manager of the asset company. So this is the change, and this will create some sort of fissures, a tax loophole, so to speak, whereby multinational companies, and this sort of represents a more advanced form than simply an advanced form of capitalism than just an individual managing a simple asset. This could be bifurcated into various levels of management, various entities over various countries. Now, it's no doubt that the traditionally taxed investment fund, where the asset is with the dollar sign, could be a loophole. You'd put all your, investment in a low tax jurisdiction, Luxembourg, the Caymans, Macau, places like that. But now we're going to have a fissure where OECD countries, if they adopt this proposal by the OECD, they will tax where the asset is managed, or give taxing right, that is, to where the asset is managed, and the U.S. will give the taxing right to where the asset is located. So what you could do is you could put your asset managers in New York, and you could put your asset in another country that has adopted these rules, possibly with a low tax jurisdiction, and then this will be a classic loophole where the U.S. will forego taxing rights and the other country will forego taxing rights. Now, where is the origin of this arm's length principle, six-step allocation of risk? Again, risk in the OECD and in transfer pricing guidelines is very important for pricing a transaction. And the price of the transaction can be manipulated, admittedly, through contractual allocation and reallocation. And so the OECD's mantra is conduct trumps contracts. Conduct trumps contracts. And while it's a good mantra, and they're definitely on the right spirit of things, there are some problems with the fissures that will be created. So there's a six-step risk allocation. Identify the economically significant risk with specificity. You're still looking at contractual. With these first two steps, analyze the contractual assumptions. Step 3 is still contractual assumptions. Step 4 and 5 are where things change, and you're no longer looking just at, and step 6, where you're just looking at the contracts, you're looking at the function, so to speak. And step 6 looks at you're giving the final pricing of the transaction. So let's go into step 5, where there's a two-pronged test. You have the control over the risk, and whether the party assuming the risk has the capacity to absorb the risk consequences. This is coming straight from the OECD Action 9. Now, control over risk is defined in paragraph 1.65 of Action 9 as the capability to make decisions regarding risk and the capability to make decisions on whether and how to respond to risk. Paragraph 186 defines the assumption of risk as the financial capacity to assume risk. But looking back at the former decisions, what this really is saying is, regardless whatever the contracts are saying, if we're actually looking at these capability to make decisions, capability to respond to risk, and the financial capacity to assume risk. And contracts don't matter at all. Now, presumably, the OECD came to some sort of compromise because most of the OECD's money comes from the United States, and the OECD is very reluctant to cause problems with the United States in regards to these issues because the United States does have financial control over the OECD. But the OECD countries basically it seems they made a compromise where it looks like we're still looking at contracts, but we're really not. So just to confirm, that's what the OECD is doing. Let's look at U.S. tax court jurisprudence. Now, I went over a number of cases, but I want to focus on the two most recent transfer pricing cases from the U.S. tax court. This is a diagram right here of the U.S. Medtronic Group. It's a little complex, but this is actually only a portion of what was involved in the case, and this is only a portion of what was involved in the case was the cardiac research development team for creating pacemakers. But there are several other sections such as brain devices and other electronic equipment that can be implanted in human bodies. But this is just part of their pacemaker team. And what they focused on was the Puerto Rico team and the U.S. Department where decisions were made. Now, the case revolved in large extent over intangibles, but what the court decided was ultimately that the Puerto Rico company was where the assets where risk was contractually allocated, and the U.S., although having the financial capability, the assumption of risk, it met that two-pronged BEPS account. And remember, this is a post-BEPS case, 2016 when it was released. The Puerto Rico team, where the risk was contractually allocated, is where the U.S. tax court found the risk to be allocated. Now, let's go to the Amazon case that was just passed down in March of 2017. The U.S. found that that Amazon had contractually allocated risk to its Luxembourg entity in Europe, but the financial capabilities were coming from the U.S. parent. And this is just a section of the Amazon corporate group structure. So again, this reinforces, and there has been a string of cases from the 1980s indicating that U.S. transfer pricing in the U.S. tax court will always side with where the risk is contractually allocated, and that will create a fissure with BEPS. And this is just a summary of the slide. Remember, you have the individual with the asset, no incorporation, individual is taxed. You have the individual acting as an alter ego, as an agent, the company is taxed. But then you have what can arguably be construed to be the same arrangement. The asset manager, but we wouldn't tax the asset manager in the middle example, would we? Because what is the ultimate difference between the middle diagram and the right diagram? The right diagram, as the audience would be looking at it, is ultimately there is no difference. One is acting as an agent for the principal, and the principal should be the one that's taxed, not the agent. Thank you very much for your time.
Why?
Well, I mean, because these are the rules of taxation as we had exhibited them. I mean, if you looked over here, Remember, we went through this example. I mean,
It should, but I
you
mean,
well, you don't
why?
disagree. You don't disagree with this. The individual is taxed, right?
I'm not even disagreeing. I'm asking you why. What is the rationale? You said you used the word should, and I want to know why should.
Because when we're acting in a principal-agent relationship, the principal is taxed. Where the assets are is where taxation occurs.
Um, so income tax on a trust, on a real estate trust should be only on where the real estate is, as opposed to the income from the trust. The income from the real estate. I mean, I don't get it.
Well, I mean, if you're assuming that the trust, are you looking at the screen right now?
I'm thinking of reality. I mean, I don't find these things very useful. Pictures of bags of money and smiling faces, they don't help me envision what's going on. I want to ask you, and I ask you to write this for me, but I ask you to write out the definition of allocation of risk and how you tax allocation of risk. How do you place a value on risk? How do you know what is the dollar or euro value of risk?
So you're asking me, how do we value risk?
Yes.
Well, okay, so that is a very good question, but that kind of goes into the technicalities of excuse me.
Tax law?
No, of risk analysis, and that's more in the economic aspect and not the legal aspect. I'm dealing with legal structures and legal entities here of tax law. Now, that's more economic, statistical.
As I've said so many times, though, how don't we need to answer the question how can you apply these rules in the real world? You know, I want to know. I want a concrete example of an appraisal of risk and how it is allocated. I mean, and what risk of what, by the way? Risk of what?
Well, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and it's a good question, and I'm going to find your answer right here. I have it in my thesis. Actually, I'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay, we'll come back with an answer.
No. Stay there. Let me just go get something out of my backpack. Don't hang up.
Okay.
How's it going?
What happened to you?
You there?
Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
It's a long absence.
All right. So you asked me about risk allocation, am I right?
Yes, I asked you how do you appraise a risk?
How do you appraise risk? Okay, so in transfer pricing cases, in business, you often compare and face many risks. For transfer pricing purposes, the only risks that need to be considered are those that are expected to affect profit, both external risks and internal risks. So you make a list of the risks in a transactions, and you need to identify risks that will have you need to have risks that will impact the profitability of a business. So you need to do like tornado diagram, Monte Carlo sequences, financial modeling, risk simulation. So in a tornado diagram, the risks on top of the tornado diagram will be included in the functional analysis, or risk at the bottom that have little financial results are probably not going to be that important for a transfer pricing analysis. So in a tornado diagram, it's the sales prices.
Why do you have a picture of a tornado diagram?
Because this is just the technicality of risk, and it's not that important for. This is all economics and financial simulations. So in a situation where a manufacturer is selling goods to related entities, you have to figure out what the financial implications are of those, and you can do that with a tornado diagram, looking at return on investment, various scenarios, value drivers like your sales team, salaries. You look at the volatility of average of the sales prices, like if you move between $6 to $7 on a widget. This is average sales price analysis. You look at stocks, if the stock market goes up. I mean, there's all these simulations you can do. You can do a value at risk simulating, evaluating the financial capacity of bearing risks, and that usually comes out in a bell curve, where you look what's most likely going to happen and what's least likely to happen. You should look at a capital. You look at capitals and what you have in your assets are. You'd also do Monte Carlo simulations of financial and economic risks, and that looks at random probabilities that could occur. And basically, it's a lot of financial stuff. I think the whole point of this, if you do want to get into the guidelines, it ignores the transfer pricing guidelines of the OECD. Ignore corporate structures and legal arrangements between related parties, and you can't really attribute remuneration between those companies that have no functionality. You know what I mean? An investment fund by itself, I mean, it's being managed by an outside entity in that example that I gave. It has no functionality on itself. So I feel like this is going to be a problem going forward. And basically, that's that. Do you have any other questions about the substance of the talk?
That's my big one. I want a real world example of how this plays out, because I find it very difficult. You say that this is just economic theorems, but economic theorems that have no consequence in the real world, how do they help you tax? How do they help a business plan for taxation? And I don't even quite understand what you're defining as risk here. I mean, okay, I own a boat. I put a bunch of bananas on the boat. Obviously, if I own the boat and the bananas, then I ship the bananas from Honduras to New Orleans, subject to the risk that the boat with the bananas sinks. In addition, there's the risk that the seamen on board will sue me for wrongful death if they all drown.
Right.
As well. So, I mean, I can calculate the value of the boat, the value of the bananas, the potential loss of life at sea, potential of injury at sea. I mean, they don't drown. They have to be rescued.
Right, and you need to look at all these risk factors, and then how does that all lead to the profitability of the company? You need to look at.
I own it. That I can economically.
Well, I mean, the boat example is a very classic one because.
To New Orleans, so I want to know. I mean, I know I can make a profit on that, but you said that risk is only related to profit. But how about loss?
Well, I mean, that's what's your return on investment (ROI) going to be? Now, the shipping is a very classic example, actually, of a transfer pricing analysis because you look at a company such as a boating company. Specifically, imagine you have like a boat company based out of Norway that specializes in offshore oil repair. So you have a boat that docks up next to an oil refinery in the ocean and it repairs it. So actually, the manager of the company is the one who bears the risks. And that's where you do the function, asset, and risk analysis. It's not necessarily the person running the boat because he's just following orders. It's the manager of the company that's making the decisions. Okay, you go to Brazil. No, you go to Honduras. Go fix our oil rigs off the coast of Australia. Things like that.
You're making it too complicated, though. Let's just have the one boat.
Well, that isn't a transfer pricing situation.
One load of bananas from Honduras to New Orleans, and
that isn't a transfer pricing. That isn't a transfer pricing situation. Just to confirm.
Well, okay, but I mean, okay, no, I was going to try to make it into a transfer pricing situation.
So you're between two entities, between a parent company that owns two subsidiaries, one in Honduras and one in New Orleans, and they're making a sale to each other. You need to treat that sale as if you were selling to a third-party customer that's not in the corporate group, and you need to price that transaction as if you were selling it to a third-party person. That's the base.
Right. Well, okay, that's fine, but where's the risk?
Well, the risk. I mean, you look at the costs of selling or getting it onto the boat. You look at the risk. You look at salaries that need to be paid. You can use a Monte Carlo simulation to predict what the likelihood. I'd say it's a very low likelihood because with modern technology, I mean, when it happens, it hits hard, but most of the time ships don't go down, and that's why it's a fairly profitable business.
I started that because I mean, you have total loss and then you have partial loss. But what if the problem is that upon arrival in New Orleans, some bug has arrived from a different jurisdiction that infests the bananas.
Well, then your prices go down. But the thing is, you have to make these risk assessments prior to engaging in the business. You always do an ex ante analysis rather than an ex post analysis. Ex post analysis is considered unfair.
Because taxation is going to be ex post.
No, taxation will be ex post, but a transfer pricing analysis, you need to set the price prior to the sale occurring. And presumably the sale already occurred because you're transferring items from Honduras to New Orleans. And if the plan was to sell them after arriving in New Orleans, then you do the analysis when you'd be in New Orleans. I mean, you're getting into the technicalities of a transfer pricing analysis, which is not the subject of this thesis. What the subject of this thesis is the legal implications of agency structures. And the risk allocation, Monte Carlo sequences.
Wait, let's try it or do it again. Almost the real world. United Fruit Company owns the plantations in Honduras and the distributors in New Orleans.
Okay.
But does not own the ships. The ships are each independently
Fair enough.
captain, and
Fair enough.
they're your managers.
Yeah, fair enough. You'd get a risk assessment based off the ships, and I think everything else is almost irrelevant. You get a risk assessment. What's potent in transfer pricing is the price that you're selling it from one entity in Honduras to another entity in New Orleans. What's that price? What's it look like? You do the risk analysis that the economists do. The legal structure and its implications is what I'm focusing on.
Okay, but I don't get other than actual loss. What are the legal implications of it? I mean, what
An agency principal allocation. The United States will say that where the asset is what's more relevant. So probably Honduras, and then it's sold, and then it transfers legal ownership, is where it should be taxed. So the price should not be artificially inflated or deflated according to whatever the tax purposes are for taxation. Accounting purposes, they should be what they are. Well, how about we go over to control over risk, capability to make decisions, capacity, assuming risk. Does this argument make sense? That there's going to be a fissure between OECD BEPS and traditionally taxed. Does that make sense?
I guess it would make. You see, this is what I've been asking you this ever since you first started working on this topic. Give me concrete examples. I'm asking you to use.
I gave the Amazon example and I gave the Medtronic example.
You didn't give it to me in a way that I still don't understand. Okay, well, then explain Amazon to me.
Okay, well, let's just do Medtronic first. You had a Puerto Rican subsidiary, and like I said, this is a huge corporate structure. I mean, the web just goes on and on. This is just part of it. Puerto Rican subsidiary is where the asset is located, and
where's the asset?
It was the manufacturer of a pacemaker, and
how is a process an asset?
Well, I mean, the manufacturing capability, the people there. It focused a lot on intangibles because
you're saying the factory was the asset.
Well, yes, the factory was the asset, but also the intangible is an asset too. Intangibles are assets. And the question was, like I said, this was a very fact-intensive case on intangibles. And they had to determine where was the intangible asset that made this company, because a pacemaker, in theory, is easy to put together. But what's the intangible? In theory, it's actually not easy to put together.
But it was also quality control.
Yeah, it was very important quality control. And so the Medtronic argued that there was very important quality control going on in Puerto Rico. So there was a lot of intangible assets in terms of quality control in Puerto Rico, and then the IRS said, well, no, the decisions were being made in the U.S. The sales team, all this stuff was in the U.S. We should tax it in the U.S. The U.S. tax court said no, it should be taxed in Puerto Rico. So we tax it here because even though the asset is located there and financial control is over in the U.S., that's that. Same with Europe. Where do you think the big decisions of Amazon are made? There's no way that there's probably, I don't know what exactly the numbers are, but Amazon.
What are the big decisions at Amazon?
Well, I mean, they have an incredibly, intense corporate structure in Amazon. I mean, they're based out of Seattle, of course. And they have an incredible organizational structure with the CEO on top. You have the global, you have a global hierarchy, geographic divisions. But in Seattle, you got the CEO, you got the business development team, you got the web services, you got finance, you got the consumer business stuff, you got the main accounting in Seattle, and you got the legal and secretariat stuff in Seattle. Excuse me. And really all you have, as my understanding is, in Luxembourg, you have a few people working. You definitely have a lot of warehouses, but those aren't key decision drivers. Most of the big decisions are made in Seattle. I mean, maybe they meet somewhere else, but I mean, they're incorporated in Seattle and things like that. And of course, they have geographic divisions, and that's what Amazon was arguing, that with what the IRS was. No, Amazon was arguing they did a lot of work in Luxembourg. The IRS was arguing that they did a lot of work in the U.S. And ultimately, the U.S. tax court decided, well, we can't allocate everything to the U.S. because it's very important work that they're doing in Luxembourg. And I mean, that's just you can look over the case, disagree with it, agree with it. I'm not saying I think there's an overarching problem with transfer pricing. I mean, you see this diagram here. Well, not here.
I think that's a terrible diagram, by the way. I don't see how those diagrams help us at all.
Wait, the smiley face in the box of money?
Yeah, the bag of money. How do those help us at all?
Well, I mean, when you're looking at corporate tax structures, you're often just drawing boxes, and I kind of wanted to make a visualized representation and communicate. I've been reading a lot of Harvard Business Review articles on communicating your idea. You really don't want to use a lot of words in a PowerPoint presentation. I'd rather have no words in this entire presentation and just make simple diagrams that people will remember. I've been reading, I even read like a few books this year from Harvard Business School on communicating ideas, and really I think minimalism in PowerPoints is good. I mean, this is almost too much words for me, but I mean, it's just part of the game. I think this is okay because of defining certain sections, and I mean, this is just way too much, but this is the diagram that I have. And I'd rather people, because you don't want your audience to be reading something, you want them to be listening to you. If you wanted them to read something, you just hand out a pamphlet. But I think using these diagrams is really helpful. It's entertaining, it's fun, it's cool.
What does it mean, though? I mean, you've got faces pointing at bags of money. What the fuck does it mean?
All right, well, it means that there's control, and, that's a good question. Asset and control. Control over the asset. But, I mean, I think this is a good diagram in some sense. I mean, I think this one is the best slide right here if you're looking at it, and the rest is sort of just subsidiary. And I'd really rather...
You in the spirit of Dylan Lorsdorfer, what does it all mean? It doesn't, I mean, what do you think what should I get out of this chart that you say is so good?
I think it's that traditionally we used to be taxed down where the money is, and the OECD is going to tax up here. This is going to create tax loopholes. That's it. I mean, my thesis is a simple thesis. The point is, U.S. does this, OECD BEPS suggests this, here's the tax loophole, and here's the problem.
I guess part of the problem is, to me, that contracts are agreements.
Yes.
Money is a form of... but money only has value by agreement.
What, you mean agreement with the government?
Well, no. I mean, in foreign exchange situations, agreement between parties. When you're transferring across borders, the sad truth is that euros in Greece are worth a lot more than euros in Germany. Even when you're using the same unit, you're subject to the vagaries of...
What do you mean euros in Greece are worth more than euros?
Euros are way scarcer in Greece, and so they're worth a lot more than they are in Germany or the Netherlands.
I suppose that's possibly true.
It's definitely true because
I mean, you can look at GDP numbers and things like that. That is that, but that isn't the focus of the thesis. It's getting a little bit late too.
But it should be something that you're addressing, because you're saying that that OECD looks at conduct, and basically conduct about where the money is. And where
conduct.
But conduct is constructed by decisions like, do I keep my money in Greece or Germany?
Well, yeah, and that's a great example. Yeah.
And I mean, should that be taxed differently? It's the same unit of money. It's all part of the same. I bet they both subscribe to the same version of the OECD, but the euros, because they're scarcer in Greece or Portugal, they're worth more money there. I mean, they're worth more labor. They command more of the productive the productive capacity of the nation is one way of putting it. €1 commands a lot more in Greece than it does in Germany because they just don't have as many euros.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the GDP
It doesn't matter. Just accept that as a general principle that Greece is a poorer country in the sense it has less money. It's not that complicated. You don't have to know the exact figures to say this conduct that you're talking about. What about the contract that says that we're going to keep our money in Greece because it commands more of the productive capacity or the real estate or the assets? The money that we keep in Greece will give us more power. €100 or 100 million euros in Greece gives us a lot more power than 100 million in Germany, because in Germany a lot of people have 100 million euros, and in Greece not many people do.
Well, I mean, fair enough. I'm getting a little tired, but do you think this is good? I mean, my presentation is tomorrow.
Well, I guess it's just a beginning. I mean, it seems like there are more unanswered questions than there are answered questions. What time's your presentation?
9 a.m., June 26th, IBFD, which is in Rijtland Park, Amsterdam, the Netherlands, in room 428, I believe.
And how long is it supposed to go?
Tops 20 minutes, but I always like cutting it short to give everybody some free time, maybe some free breaks, or allow people to ask questions and engage in a conversation, which I think benefits everyone more.
Your presentation is 20 minutes, but how long do the questions go?
Oh, no, that includes questions, yeah. Or it should, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for helping me, and I love you.